He would have known exactly what he was going to say. I have thought about Dad a lot this week, and I really thought that what was going to happen was that it would come to me in the moment that I was standing here. I think something that my siblings and I all agree on is that this is as much about everyone here as it is about my dad. This town was huge in forming the man that you've all come to know and respect. And he took every piece of interaction with all of you into himself. And that helped him become the man that he was. So a couple of things. I just want to go over, I want to make sure that as we go through this process that everybody knows we'd love to have you participate. We have 4 speakers that are scheduled, but by no means is that all we expect to have. If somebody has something they'd like to say about Dad, please feel free to come up, or later on, if you want to tell a story off to the side. I'll be meeting folks in the men's locker room to tell some inappropriate stories, but don't hold back. I wanted to, for a second here, I wanted to read something that was in Dad's Life is Luck book. I just read it this morning and I thought it would be a good way to start off and actually acknowledge the town. Mom and Dad were the first ones who made me feel good. I just felt safe and secure. I remember going to bed as a teenager and thinking I'm living the best days of my life. Oh yes, I had my problems and disappointments, but I knew Mom and Dad, particularly Dad, would always be there to take care of me. My growing up years from 1928 to 1946 in Surrey were wonderful and carefree, and much, as I suspect, like the many boys of the Depression era, growing up in rural America. I think that was the basis of who he was. And I think that we'll get into more detail as we move forward. But right now, I would like to ask Sally Lovegren Merchant to come up and sing Amazing Grace.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, snares, and toils, I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious dear that grace appeared the hour I first believed. My God has promised good to me, whose word my hope secures. God will my will and portion be, as long as life endures. When we
I forgot to really mention that Sally is a very close friend and really almost a member of our family. She and I have dated for 5 years. I used to leverage my good family to date women. The next person who's going to speak is my sister Lynn. And I just wanted to say that Lynn has been an amazing rock through this entire process. Living in Bucksport, she had the lion's share of going to see Dad. Not only go to see him, but also coordinate many, many doctor's visits. Always be there in an emergency and do the same thing for Mom. And she has just done an amazing job. So come on up.
I want to welcome all of you and say that my dad would have been very happy to see all of you here. It's very fitting, perfect really, for this celebration to be held here. For he termed his lucky life, he termed his life to be so lucky from being here at Surrey and in this school. He gave several speeches and presentations right in this room as members of the SCIA, the Historical Society, and this location is also special because the original school, which stood in this location, was called the Claude L. Bonsi School, since my grandfather, who was then a town selectman, was instrumental in spearheading its construction. Also, my grandmother Rena was a beloved teacher who taught in this location and in other schools in Surrey, and now I have the good fortune to teach just down the hall. This is also where, in festivities located here 15 or 20 years ago, my dad was instrumental in hosting the Surrey Village School celebration, and that's the picture over there, the drawing of, at that time, that my dad got very lucky to win in a lottery situation. We couldn't believe that he was the one that ended up with the picture. When I spoke to the reporter from the Ellsworth American who wrote an article about Dad titled Beloved Son of Surrey, Oz Bonsi Dies at 88, she asked me what I thought was behind all of Dad's scrapbooks, and I wasn't quite awake that morning, and my first response was ego. But as I contemplated that question and I browsed through Dad's scrapbooks, I realized that his scrapbooks are more or less a modern day extension of what has come to be known as a gratitude journal. My father felt so lucky and so grateful for everything he had in his life. He was born to loving parents, grew up here in Surrey, Maine, and his mother, and I'm not kidding, thought he was perfect. We have her on video explaining that. I never heard her say a bad word or tell any bad stories about Dad. His wife, my mother Ann, thought he was perfect most of the time. And I thought he was perfect too. And that pretty much led right up to the end of his days, the way he handled his life all the way through from the beginning to end. His scrapbooks, which I encourage you to peruse afterwards when we have some food and time to talk, contain countless articles, kudos, and awards given to him and his family members. There are funny tidbits in there, tickets, notes, letters from his children and his grandchildren, because he wanted to make sure he didn't miss anything about his life that might be the least bit tiny important. Last spring, he even asked Sharon, one of his caregivers, to go to, I believe, the Ellsworth Library. He'd been thinking about it, and he didn't know if he had all the box scores from the games that he had played in high school in his scrapbook. And Sharon dutifully went and did all this research and got him some more little tidbits to include in there. Often when I visited Dad, he was reviewing his scrapbooks, and sometimes he would start from number 1 to number, I don't know how far they go, 100, I don't know how many there are. But sometimes he had Mom cuddled at his side and they would go through the scrapbooks, and they had some amazing times in their lives, and it was a really wonderful way for them to continue to bond. And often when I visit Mom, She's rereading the dozens and dozens of love letters she and Dad wrote each other when they were courting. Theirs was a love story that started in this little town where at 12 years old, my mother determined she was going to marry my dad. And 6 years later, she did just that, marrying at the little Methodist church just down around the corner, where they concluded the cemetery by running down the road to the reception at my grandmother Helen McGraw's house. There's so many stories I could tell, and so as a family, we have more material and mementos than you could even possibly believe. So it was a little hard to cull through and figure out what was important, what was appropriate, and what I could talk about in this event. And I didn't have enough time to really archive everything, but I went through several things. One of the things, in the 1970s, Warner and Cameron and I were young adults living with our parents. And this is, as you know, before cell phones, before answering machines and all of that. So I wanted to be sure that we were all communicating really well. So we had a spiral-bound notebook that we would leave each other notes in. And most of the notes, as Emily, Ryan's girlfriend, can attest to after reading through several of them today, are very funny. We were very funny in those notebooks, or we thought we were. We were very sarcastic, and there were things like, don't forget to fill up the gas tank the next time you use the car. There was one note that Emily pointed out to me this morning that said, girls, don't forget to vote, which I thought was particularly interesting given that election day is nearby. But this particular note was I'm not sure if it was actually in the notebook or as a separate correspondence, but my mother was having a little trouble with my dad, and she left him the following note. Darling, in the future, would you please remember to, number one, close the front door when entering or leaving. Number two, shake out the clothes before placing them in the dryer. Number three, wipe the mustard off the counter when making a sandwich. Actual note, not making this up. Number four, clean up the popcorn and pan before retiring. Number five, hang the dish towel on the rack, not on your shoulder. And number six, polish the sink after doing the dishes. Thank you, Anne. In response, the following note appeared on her desk. Anne, now this is when I'm going to cry. Please take the time to continue, 1, looking so young and pretty, 2, renting sensuous movies, 3, cooking delicious meals, 4, paying for our capital improvements, being such a wonderful grandmother, that was 5, and number 6, being so good to my mother. Thank you, Osmond. Starting in the 1970s, my dad kept diaries too. And he always lamented that he hadn't started keeping a diary much earlier in his life. Last spring, I visited Dad, and when I walked in after a long, hard day at school teaching, he was lying in bed reading his 1978 diary. Now, I too am an inveterate diary keeper. And so I remember what happened in 1978. So when I walked in and saw it was 1978, I was a little nervous. And he says, want me to read some of this out loud to you? So I sat down and I listened to him read. And there was some minutiae of family and work life. And then there were several tales involving me and my brother. Not events that we were both involved in, but we were both carrying on doing something. So I was kind of holding my breath as I sat there, and all of a sudden my dad reads, this is an exact quote, "For the moment, Warner is our only normal child. Yes, exactly, Kim. As most of you know, that moment continues today, which is why Warner is the executor of the will. Osmond Bonzi was honest about his flaws and challenges. He always pushed himself and tried to do the right thing. He developed diabetes in his 50s, and his diabetes nurse said he was her favorite patient, in large measure because he had such a good attitude about managing his disease. The biggest gifts my father gave my siblings and me were the gifts of trust and integrity. He trusted us to manage his health, his finances, and his overall well-being, and he never second-guessed any of our decisions. In fact, even when the going got tough, and we had to tell him he needed to take a difficult action, he'd contemplate that and finally say, "I accept that." That trust was such a gift to our family. He was a role model for how to respond in difficult situations. Dan Baker, the author of What Happy People Know, says that joyful people finish their life stories on a different note, appreciation. Right until the end, Dad talked about how grateful he was for his very rich life. My dad loved baseball, especially his Red Sox. Many years ago when Cam, Warner, and I were in our 20s, this might have been in 1978 now that I think about it, he took the three of us out to lunch. And he said he had something special he wanted to tell us. And he told us the following. He said, "I feel like I'm in the World Series, bottom of the ninth, 7th game, bases loaded, scores tied. I'm up to bat, it's 3-2, and I hit a home run. That's how I feel about my life." My father, Osmond Clark Bonzi, led a remarkable life filled with humor, respect, and love. He's smiling down on all of us right now. We love you, Dad.
That was beautiful. Thank you. And obviously well written. Mom never said I was perfect, which I'm kind of upset about now. I don't remember much about 1978. And my perfect sister, Lorna, who is the executor of the will come up to read a letter that Dad wrote to Mom. And you have done an amazing job. Thank you.
Mom and Dad always told me I was perfect. Anytime I talk to them. I appreciate that. I also remember 1978, and it was a very good year, and I have always been kind of secretive. And so Dad never knew a lot about what I did in 1978. There may be somebody here who knows. Lynn talked about, did such a wonderful job, but talked about all of the diaries and the scrapbooks and the letters, and my God, you could not get through all of them in your lifetime. And I was very happy when I'd only spent, the past 8 hours reading everything that I could, that finally I found a letter that I thought would just be fabulous to read. Cameron mentioned how Mom knew from the age of 12 that she wanted to marry Dad.